Holland now is as bright as a highlighter. Here's a look at McFarlane Toys, DC Multiverse, the Gold Label Collection, DC Rebirth Swamp Thing. While scientist Alec Holland was working on a formula to grow plant life where there was none, a rival organization vying for the formula set off a bomb that covered Alec in his biorestorative serum. To escape the flames of the explosion, he stumbled onto the nearby swamp where he mutated into the strange hero known as Swamp Thing. Swamp Thing has superhuman strength and the ability to regenerate any portion of his body. He can also command plants to do his bidding and change locations instantly by inhabiting vegetation anywhere in the world. Now, just before we weed through all the accessories that come included with Swamp Thing, I'd like to first thank the folks over at McFarlane Toys that did provide this sample of the new glow-in-the-dark Swamp Thing that we could have a look at in this review. Following to that, let's grab the tape measure and see how tall this big boy stands. One of my only real criticisms about the figure was I felt like he was maybe just too big, considering that when you compare him with the rest of the DC Multiverse figures, he literally casts a shadow over them. Either way, though, you're looking at Swamp Thing standing about 10.5 inches in height, or the figure's going to be about 27 centimeters tall. And while I may not have had the chance to have a look at the Gold Label Edition Swamp Thing that had the different head, that alternate head, by the way, will come included with this figure, so you get the chance to see it. I did, in fact, get that Gold Label Edition Swamp Thing, but I just haven't gotten around yet to having a look at him. I will, though, however, slide over the Swamp Thing that we're about to have a look at. He teeters, he totters. I hope he doesn't fall over. We're going to bring in the other Swamp Thing, who has even more problems to stand. This one was, if you saw my review of this Swamp Thing, this had the bum knee, or bum thigh. The problem with this one, actually, is the fact that by the assembly of this in the factory, it looks like they took the joint and they flipped it around. So instead of the joint being where it should really be, it's facing the opposite direction altogether. So this Swamp Thing, unfortunately, I have still yet to really replace it. Has a real tough time, obviously, as you guys can see, has a real tough time to stand. So I have to kind of lean him slightly to the side, but his leg will always be sort of, yeah, you can see, he's shimmying off to the side like this. But at least if I can actually the two standing side to side, it'll give you at least an idea of how they are exactly the same Swamp Things, just with the different color of coat of paint. I also wanted to bring in Batman, the recently looked at Nightfall Batman, to show you just how much taller Swamp Thing is. I still feel, honestly, that he's maybe too tall. I would have maybe at the very least made him about the size of where his elbow goes. Still make him taller than a regular DC Multiverse figure, but maybe just not the height that he is right now. Other figures we can also bring in for comparisons just to show you how much taller Swamp Thing is. Here's what he looks like with the Anti-Monitor, and here's also what he looks like with the recently also looked at Doomsday. As for the figure's accessories, Swamp Thing first includes a DC logo stand. One thing, though, you'll see missing this time around is the actual DC logo, which would normally be down below. It does have Swamp Thing, which is a nice touch to see on the top of the stand. I did also want to bring in one of the original stands so you can see, like, the coloring of actually the plastic that they've used isn't quite the same black. It's almost like a little bit of an off black. I have my black light here because, of course, Swamp Thing does have glow-in-the-dark features. It almost looking at this like the Swamp Thing logo may also glow in the dark. Although the time that I've had the lights turned off to check that, to test that, it doesn't seem to be the case. But it sort of does look like in a way that the font would also glow as well. Putting that to the side, the figure also comes included with the podium stand that we see with a lot of the more higher-end DC releases. This still has the DC logo, but you can see it's been washed with all this nice additional green. It's sort of just been brushed across. In some cases, it doesn't look like there's a rhyme or reason as to where they put the paint, but at least it looks, sort of has a mossier look to it, and I guess that was the intended plan. It's hollow on the back, though, and it does have a slot which can actually, of course, hold the card. We'll just take the card for right now. I want to show you guys what it looks like. A really stellar-looking card with this release. I also really like the fact that the border, I'm just going to bring, for example, Doomsday's card in, for example. Actually, this was Superman from the Doomsday release. You can see, like, the border, in fact, is a different color. I keep going, though, back to my black light, convinced that every single thing that comes with this figure is going to be glow in the dark. But again, it only looks like it probably does glow in the dark. I don't think it's actually the case. But a really nice image, though, of Swamp Thing either way. Swamp Thing is the glow in the dark edition, featured down below, of course. And then on the back, not necessarily a read-up about Swamp Thing, but it does at least tell you that this is a certificate of authenticity. This certifies that the limited edition worldwide product, the Swamp Thing figurine, is authentic and officially licensed by McFarlane Toys. The figurine was created, developed, and designed by Todd McFarlane and his award-winning design group. Yada, yada, yada. You can see it doesn't actually have out of 3,000, though. They've actually just put it as 0. I'm not sure, based on only the one I have in front of me, whether those numbers will then change, whether it will actually say 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 3,000. Does have his signature down below. This has just been printed in place. But a nice looking card either way. And of course, when it comes to displaying this guy, you will just then take the card and slot it into the provided podium and then have that displayed along with the figure. Let's move for that right now, at least, everything out of the way. I wanted to then show you guys the rest of the accessories the figure comes included with. The neat thing, though, about the figure is that it comes included also with the alternate head sculpt that was available for the Gold Label Edition Swamp Thing if you didn't get the chance to get it. Before we do that, of course, I wanted to also show you that the fact the figure comes included with the spike. The spike sort of does looks a little like a fungus, I suppose, something that maybe be growing in the backyard of somebody's house. Need I say more? It is nicely colored, though. You've got like the darker green to the top here, more that glow-in-the-dark color down below here. And again, just to bring back in my black light, don't worry, I'm going to cut the lights in a moment, but you can see how it's absorbing all the light source of that black light that's shining on it right now. This can, of course, then swap out with his existing hand, but just before we do that, I wanted to bring in the original one so you guys can see the difference between the two. They kind of look also like pods that would eventually become people. If you ever see giant pods, by the way, in anyone's backyard, you may want to duck for cover. They're trying to replace the entire neighborhood. But anyways, though, I mean, these are, again, the pieces themselves are exactly the same. This would have come included with both the original Swamp Thing and also the Gold Label Edition, I believe, also came included with the exact same piece as well. You can swap that out by taking his existing hand and just popping it out from the provided socket, and then peg in the spiked hand if you wanted to have the figure displayed with that. For me, I would much rather had they not used a spike, for example, and included, for example, just like some spaghetti strands of swamp strings, you know, again, like little ropes or something like that. Just a continuation, essentially, of the one that we have right here. Just more of those, kind of just like intermingling with one another. This, again, looks more to be something like he's going to be impaling somebody with. But again, I would love if they had included, like, you know, again, some spaghetti straps or something like that. He could. Anyways, let's just replace that. We'll pop back in the existing hand. And of course, the other accessory that comes included with the figure as well involves me having to pick this up. He comes included with the rooted head sculpt that, again, would have only been available with the Gold Label Edition Swamp Thing, which I still have yet to have the chance to review. It pretty much is the exact same head sculpt. The only thing that's really then changed between the two is the fact that this does have the additional vines, big giant limbs of the tree that rooted out from the sides of his face. I personally like the more defaulted head sculpt myself, but I can certainly get behind why people would be so interested in this head sculpt. It's got some really interesting colors to it. Changing out the head actually is quite easy here for Swamp Thing, despite the size of figure that you're dealing with. Simply just pop the head from the provided peg, remove the head, I should say, from the provided peg. There we go. And then we're just going to replace it then with the other one. For me, again, I would rather just instead have the figure displayed with the rooted head sculpt, the non-rooted head sculpt, I should say. But we're going to go ahead, just for right now at least, pop this in place. Kind of have to sometimes put the pressure against the ball joint. I don't know why I'm having such a hard time with this, but it's essentially this head sculpt right here. Looks good. I mean, I won't fault it necessarily for not being a good head sculpt. It's really actually a quite good head sculpt. But for me, at least, I would much rather have the figure displayed with a defaulted Swamp Thing. I think what I may have had to do, I think, is probably heat the head a little bit more. I heated this up just prior to hitting record, but since the time has elapsed, I think the plastic has cooled just a little bit. But again, like, you have two different head sculpts to work with. As for the rest of the body of Swamp Thing, from his head all the way down to his very large swamp-sized feet, make sure the head, now of course the head doesn't want to stay properly in place. Just pop that all the way on there. I want to make sure it's all the way in place. Wanted to bring back in the Swamp Thing that I had looked at before. It is essentially, of course, the exact same figure from head to toe. They haven't, in this case, retooled anything between the two figure releases. So while this was and still will continue to be a great-looking Swamp Thing, they simply have just taken the same mold and now have frosted it with all this additional glow-in-the-dark paint. The paint not only has a practical purpose, of course, glowing in the dark, but it also then makes the figure a lot brighter. In a way, this kind of does remind me of the glow-in-the-dark Swamp Thing, I think, Kenner release from the Swamp Thing cartoon, where there was, in fact, a brighter color of Swamp Thing that did, in fact, glow in the dark. This original Swamp Thing, I think it does have, I think the original Swamp Thing, now that I remember, it had the arm that pulled out, and then he would just release it and it would be popping back into the forearm. Neither one of these figures actually have a gimmick, I guess, except for this one that does glow in the dark. But you can see, like, the bodies are going to be exactly the same, front and back, all the same. Even the shoulders, the arms, the forearms, the biceps, and even the lower legs are all exactly the same. Whereas, again, I did have the problem with this one. And again, that wasn't across the board either, full disclosure. It was only on mine. You can kind of actually even see, I'm just going to bring the leg out here. You see how this one is sort of cupped around the joint? That's the way it should really look. The one that I had, strangely, was assembled wrong in the factory. I probably should have gotten around to really replacing it, but being that I did also have the gold label edition of this guy that did have the alternate head sculpt, what I might just end up doing, though, is taking the normal head from this one and moving it then onto that other body and just having a regular Swamp Thing, so then I could technically have two. But the color on this one is, again, very nicely handled. You get the darker green foliage for basically the base coat, and then again, like, they've added all this brighter green, all the other leaves, all the vines and all the other things that would be growing all over this guy's body. All those seem to be the colors, all these seem to be the parts that have been painted in the glow-in-the-dark paint. Now again, I can take my black light and we're going to shine this just across it so you can see it's on the forehead, it's on the chin, the chest, the arms, forearms, and even down below on the legs here. The parts that they have left off, though, you can see right here, all the interior parts of the arm, the joints, for example, and even the joints to the knees, get very little in the way of that glow-in-the-dark paint. But it does give you at least an idea of how this does glow in the dark. I will, though, in a second, cut the lights so you can actually see how well that glow in the dark works on the figure itself. With the lights now cut, what I will do again is shine the light over across Swamp Thing's face and body so you can see how well it will absorb that light. And then when I move it, though, away, you can see how that does store the light. Now, the longer, of course, you're going to be having this shining across Swamp Thing's body, of course, the longer the amount of time that it's going to be absorbing the light, and it's going to hold the glow in the dark a lot better than what it is. Just to, though, put this down here for a second, going back to a point I mentioned earlier about the display stand, I'm going to shine it across this. It did take, though, a little bit longer of time for the font to at least absorb the light, but when I move it away, it does in fact glow in the dark as well. And the other thing I also did want to show you guys as well is that the glow-in-the-dark podium, the podium itself, all that additional green that they've added down below here, absorbing all the fluorescent light here, all the black light, you can see also does illuminate. Although, of course, the longer time you spend on shining this on Swamp Thing, for example, the better both him, the stand, and the podium will glow in the dark. Jumping back now more to visible studio light, I did also take the time and I swapped out Swamp Thing's head. I just went back and heated the head again so it would be fitting over top of the ball peg as we have a look at the figure's accessories. So first, the head, being that it's on a dumbbell ball joint, so essentially there's a ball joint right here inside the neck. You wouldn't be able to see it unless you had x-ray vision. And then there's one that's right here. Between those two, Swamp Thing can move his head far enough down that you can really get more of a somber look to the figure's face, like he's a bit in mourning. Somebody just cut down one of his friendly trees. You can also bring the head up, and you can also rock it back and forth. And of course, with all that as well, you can rotate the head all the way around. As for the arms easily hinge out. Now, one thing that they was smart that they did, and this hasn't been changed with this Swamp Thing from the earlier one, is that with these leaf shoulders that he has, they've hinged them back here. So when it comes to actually bringing his arms out, the leaves do a well enough job of staying completely out of the way once you make like a tree and get out of here. You can also take those arms, of course, and you can rotate them all the way around. The figure has a bicep swivel. He has only just a single hinge in the elbow, but at least you can also as well rotate the hand all the way around with, of course, the vine that's sticking out the end of his forearm. Upper torso is on a ball joint. It doesn't have the most ease, I should say, at rotating the torso all the way around. It doesn't do as good of a job moving, say, up and down, but it does rotate back and forth fairly easy. And then the figure also does have an abdomen crunch or an abdomen ball joint there as well. This part of his trunks, like all most DC Multiverse figures that we tend to look at, tend to have softer plastic. And Swamp Thing, even though he is made of foliage, has the exact same thing happening here as well. The legs are I'm happy to report that the legs are at least functioning on both of them. This is the way the joints actually have looked, not the one that I did get from before. And the legs, of course, move forward. They move back. There's a swivel at the top of the thigh, only more just the way it's been assembled in the factory. Double hinge on the knee. Good tight joints, and then there's the articulation in the feet where you can move them up and down and rock them back and forth with some nice additional toe articulation as well. I didn't already mention it, so I'll mention it now. The figure does have peg holes in the undersides of his feet, so you can use, of course, that display stand if you wanted to. All in all, yeah, again, it's a good-looking Swamp Thing. The only other thing I would have said about the Swamp Thing design is that with his feet being as small as they are, he has a little more of a harder time at times to be standing properly. Of course, if that's always the case, you could use yourself the display stand, just plug it into the provided feet holes on the bottom, and that does give him a little bit more stability. And then one last time, if I can actually get this guy to stand properly, here's what he looks like with the original Swamp Thing, who unfortunately is a bit worse for wear. Just with the problem with, first of all, the construction of the figures having the smaller feet the way that they are was already going to be giving Swamp Thing some problems. But then again, with mine, having the construction with the joint being flipped all the way around, this Swamp Thing, for me at least, it was always the hardest figure to stand on my shelf. Still continues to be the hardest figure to stand on my shelf. What I may, though, ultimately do is, if I can get around to reviewing the gold labeled edition that basically had this head sculpt right here, I might just switch them around, take this head sculpt off, swap it then with the body, because the bodies are going to be exactly the same with the gold label edition. And then what I may just end up doing is have then the Swamp Thing, the proper Swamp Thing that I had the original one, I might have him then display with the original Swamp Thing head. And you never know, maybe now that I have the glow-in-the-dark version, I might then just opt to have the rooted head sculpt on this one. Because, of course, not only will the head sculpt change between the two figures, but because now this has also the additional glow-in-the-dark paint, it will really differentiate, separate the two when I have them on the shelf together. Realizing that when we jumped over to the figure's posability, I called it accessories instead of articulation. Oh, silly me, you son of a gun. Though in final looks here, I've got the figure displayed, of course, with the rooted head sculpt and now the spikes sticking out from the end of his forearm. I would almost even say if you get the chance to get the glow-in-the-dark Swamp Thing for yourself, unless you really would want to have all three versions of Swamp Thing on your shelf, I think you probably could just pass on the idea of getting the gold label edition one. Not this one, the original one that came included with this alternate head sculpt. If you're lucky enough to say find this one, you could have then this one displayed with the OG, the original Swamp Thing on your shelf. Because I do really think that the glow-in-the-dark paint adds something to the figure. Sometimes though, when you do glow-in-the-dark figures that aren't naturally, say, that color, glow-in-the-dark paint does stand out like a sore rooted thumb. Not this time around. I think the glow-in-the-dark paint not only does show well when it's actually glowing, but even when the lights are turned back on, I think it brings a little bit more to the table of Swamp Thing sculpt. And some of those cool rooted things that the artists the talented artists over at McFarlane Toys did sculpt into the figure in the first place, I think stand out a little bit more here on this release. There are still an opportunity, I feel, that the figure could have had some additional browns. I think that may have been even one thing I mentioned in the earlier review of Swamp Thing. There is a lot of green, that maybe just adding just a little bit of brown, maybe some of the budded flowers on the back of its body, maybe add a little bit of paint to that. But overall though, head to toe, what a neat Swamp Thing this is, and I'm glad to actually now be able to say I have a Swamp Thing that doesn't have a bum thigh. What do you guys think of the figure? Let me know down below in the comments section. And if you already have the two Swamp Things, the OG and the gold label edition, could you still see yourselves venturing off to get the glow-in-the-dark gold label edition Swamp Thing? Let me know down below in the comments section. Once again, a big thank you to the folks over at McFarlane Toys that did provide this sample of the brand new Swamp Thing, the DC Rebirth Swamp Thing, the glow-in-the-dark edition. If you guys enjoyed this video, I want to hit with a like. If you guys are loving the content you guys are seeing, and you certainly do want to stick around for more DC Multiverse, well, first of all, you can hit that subscribe button down below. Why not? You can also as well turn on the bell notification. But then also at the popping up the very end of this video, if you want a little bit more of DC Multiverse before you have to go on your merry little way, check out the playlist. That'll cover off everything I've ever reviewed for DC Multiverse, the present, the past, and the future. Of course, as always, guys, thanks for watching. See you guys next time.